Hello everybody, this is NinjaValU, and today we're going to be answering another one of your questions, specifically one by CenturySpicySalsa, who asks, will Darkflame universe have a maximum number of players, or do you think they will never have that problem? So I guess there are multiple questions going on here. Let's begin with the question of why DLU might have a maximum number of players on release in the first place. The main reason for this will be server stability. To take an extreme example, DLU's alpha testing was very laggy, as the server wasn't great at handling that number of players. As you push player numbers higher and higher, you get all sorts of problems, from the basic problem of lag to rare bugs occurring more often. The problem of rare bugs occurring isn't a problem specifically with server size, although often their probabilities can be exacerbated with lag and with concurrent player numbers, since doubling the number of players will often do as much to the probability of getting a rare bug as just running the server for twice as long. This is a roundabout way of saying there will be very few bugs that would occur with 100 players and not with 10. So regardless on the size of the server, still you would want to iron these bugs out anyway. But the question basically comes down to the fact that the number of players the server can handle is directly related to how many people it can have on without becoming unplayably laggy. Let's take a second to consider what the server being laggy looks and feels like. The most obvious things are missions and smashables, both of which require that the server reply to a request sent by the client. A laggy server means you're going to have to wait a while between pressing shift and seeing the accept mission dialog. But that's not all of it. Perhaps more interestingly, the server has a responsibility of handling some, although not all, of the game's physics. So a reduction in server speed would result in a jerky motion of enemies and enemy latency. In other words, enemies acting as though you were still in some past position. This isn't necessarily a huge problem until the client and server have to cooperate on something, for instance on fighting a mech. In a fight, the client is in charge of interpreting your actions, in this case completely button mashing the Alt key. This will make your character attack, and if an enemy is within range, will make you attack that enemy, sending a message to the server to let it know you're attacking this particular enemy. Since it's a great idea to always try and reduce problems due to latency wherever possible, the game will take it on trust that you actually smashed the mech and will show the smashing animation on your screen by removing the enemy for a few seconds whilst waiting for the server to act. However, if the server doesn't confirm this smash by despawning the mech, after a short amount of time it will reappear on your screen as before. During this time, however, you'll be unable to attack the mech. This becomes an issue on very laggy servers. So what's the alternative? Well, there isn't one. The server can't take it on trust, however, that you're sending out the correct attack packet, and will need to perform various checks, such as whether or not you're attacking with the right weapon, for one thing, but also on the cooldown for your attacks, that your client can't just simply spam attack packets at all loaded objects simultaneously. And this provides a problem, because the client will only attack something if you're near enough to it to attack, but the server will only let the attack go through if it also thinks you're close enough to it. Whilst all this is going on, the mech has pretty much free reign to attack you back, even though you are unable to attack it. And if you're attacking the mech whilst the mech is itself despawned, because you think you've killed the mech, but the server disagrees with you, then the mech will continue to attack you, with you being unable to do anything back since it's just not appearing on your screen, and the server can't send attack messages if your client's not asking it to. And this is far from a hypothetical. Although I don't know the precise workings of DLU's server, something very similar to this particular bug was seen during the crash testing, and this sort of thing really can be a problem. So we're left with an explanation as to why a player cap might be imposed by DLU. The next part of the question, however, I can't really answer. The actual numbers. I don't have anywhere near the knowledge of server operating costs to guess this sort of thing. An estimate by OpCrooks the other day, placing it at around 30,000 concurrent players for around £600 a year, is the best thing I have to go by. Make of that what you will. But it's worth noting that the limit on player numbers fundamentally comes down to server speed, and that fundamentally comes down to cost. Which brings us to another question. Where's this money coming from? I've possibly mentioned this in the past, but I reasonably often see a question of donations cropping up. Money is quite an interesting aspect in all of this. The LEGO Group has mandated that we need to be operating in a not-for-profit fashion, which means that projects can only accept donations towards the upkeep of the server. We cannot restrict content based on donations, because that would be equivalent to us selling LEGO's intellectual property, and nor can we create merchandise using any of that same IP. In other words, we only really have the option of donations to keep the server running. Ironically, however, although we can't restrict game content based off donations, the server won't be viable to keep up and running without donations. So if it looks like it's going to be hard to match the required amount of money, then we could be placed in a position where we can only run the servers if there are enough donations, ironically putting us in a position of withholding LEGO's content unless paid money. But I'm pointing that out mostly because I find it kind of funny. If it does come to that, I don't think LEGO would actually act against us. But this raises far more questions. If server costs are related to the number of players, it might seem like a pretty good idea to put a cap in place. After all, What costs money is the fact we might have to cope with a large number of players at once, not actually having to cope with that number of players all the time. We'd need a large server in order to cope with a worst case scenario, but we might only reach it rarely. The idea of putting a cap in place is designed to counteract this. Most of the time it wouldn't come into effect and wouldn't affect player numbers greatly, but it would let us guarantee we'd never reach the rare extremes for which we'd have to strengthen our servers otherwise. So a server cap on concurrent players seems like a pretty nice idea. However, in the rest of this video, I'd like to take a look at what the consequence of this might be. If we have a hugely varying server population, this seems like a great idea. What if most of the time we have a similar number of players with reasonably low variations? Maybe this is due to the community itself, or maybe it's the fact that we've already maybe had to cap the server to some extent and this just hasn't been enough. We need to cap it further. The closer we get to the average number of players, we'll begin to affect more and more players, and this begins to create a new problem. The whole reason for the cap in the first place was to reduce the cost of operating the server such that it might be able to be covered by donations. However, if we actually begin to hit average player numbers rather than the extremes, the number of players available to make donations will also begin to take a hit. To reach the stage where they're willing to donate to the project, players need a certain degree of immersion and enjoyment in it. It's a lot harder to reach that point when half the time they try to log on, they're unable to play, which places servers in quite the difficult position. They need player numbers to be low so they can reduce the cost of the servers, but high so they can fund the servers, and both effects are roughly proportional to the number of players, meaning there's not necessarily going to be a simple solution or middle ground. However, rather than ending on a down note, I'd like to point out one final effect which will help. LEGO Universe works based off of the concept of instancing. If you were looking for a friend and took a ship to the same world as them, you might look forever and never find them. This occurred because LEGO Universe kept multiple copies of the same world running concurrently. Players would be assigned one when joining the world and would not see players from any other instance. The most interesting part of this is that not all instances were created equal. Certain instances, such as Crux Prime, take up far more processing power to run than other instances, and so in the end this may well quite naturally form the solution. In times of high player numbers, players may simply be restricted in the worlds they can visit. In times of high player numbers, players may simply be restricted to the worlds and instances they can visit, or perhaps only a certain number of instances of, say, Crux Prime will ever be available, or there might be far more instances of worlds without AI and the requirements of physics calculations and checks, such as maybe Nimbus Station. In this way, the server would end up structured far more like Club Penguin, with instances able to become full enough that a user would not be able to join one in peak times, but with other worlds always being available. It would be an interesting dynamic, but one that I'd personally say seems quite likely to work. And all of this is if it ends up being necessary. It could well be that the number of donations we get on average per player would be more than enough to cover the server costs, in which case none of this is necessary, no cap even. And to answer one other question about donations, which doesn't really fit with this video but it's worth talking about. Why aren't the devs currently accepting donations towards the server? Well, it turns out there's no strong legal reason to discuss this or anything like that. It's actually a question of forcing themselves into making a commitment. Developing LEGO Universe is a hobby for everyone involved, and developers need the flexibility to be able to prioritize their personal lives over developing this game, because they have to do it entirely for free. Even if donations can cover the cost of the server, the developers can't be paid without invalidating their not-for-profit status. This means that developing LEGO Universe simply cannot be more than a hobby for them. Why is this relevant to donations? Well, donations aren't given out of the goodness of people's hearts, unfortunately. There's an expectation there, and once money has changed hands, the developers will feel the need to back up those donations with actions, forcing them into a position whereby they feel the need to continue with development as though they've been paid, even though they themselves have received nothing. It's all gone towards the server. Anyway, with that, a huge thanks to CenturySpicySalsa for this question. As always, if you want your question to be featured in a video, let me know down in the comments. Every week, I pick the question I find most interesting for next week's video. That aside, you know the drill. Subscribe to the developer channels in the description, like their stuff, support them in any way you can. Your support really does mean a lot to them, and it's what makes all of this possible. With that, I've been NinjaValue, and I will see you around.